He didn't go looking for trouble. Trouble found him at a coffee shop on a quiet Saturday morning, and it arrived wearing the face of a man who had been waiting 6 years to make Ethan Cross bleed. One act of kindness, one stranger protected. And just like that, every wall Ethan had built between himself and the violence of his past came crashing down. What followed would test everything he believed about sacrifice, survival, and what a man owes the people he loves. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's get into it. The first snow of November came on a Friday night, quiet and indifferent, the way most things in Millbrook, New Hampshire arrived. Without announcement, without ceremony. By Saturday morning, it had settled into a thin white crust over the sidewalks and the rooftops and the hood of Ethan Cross's second-hand truck, and Ethan stood on the front porch in his wool socks, holding a mug of coffee he hadn't touched yet, watching it like a man who had learned not to trust anything that looked too peaceful. He was 35 years old. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been used, lines around the eyes that had nothing to do with laughter, a jaw that sat tight even when he was relaxed, hands that were too scarred and too large for the mug he was holding. People in Millbrook assumed he was a contractor because that was what he told them, which was true now, just not always. "Dad," Lily's voice came from inside, through the screen door he'd never gotten around to replacing with the storm door before the cold hit. "Are we still going to Carver's?" "That's the plan," he said. "Can I get a hot chocolate?" "You can get whatever you want as long as you're in the truck in 10 minutes. A pause. Then, "What if I want 2 hot chocolates?" He almost smiled. "Then you better start putting your boots on." Carver's Coffee and Provisions had been in the same spot on Elm Street for 22 years, wedged between a hardware store that was slowly dying and a used bookshop that somehow was not. It was the kind of place where the owner, a stout 60-year-old woman named Bet Carver, knew every regular by their order and greeted strangers with a suspicion that softened into warmth after about 3 visits. The tables were mismatched. The chairs were mismatched worse. The coffee was excellent and aggressively priced at $2 a cup, because Bet had decided a long time ago that gouging her neighbors wasn't something she was willing to do. Ethan and Lily had been coming here every Saturday for 4 years. It was, in the quiet accounting of their lives, one of the things that mattered. Lily was 12 now. She had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of green that shifted toward gray in low light, and her mother's habit of tilting her head when she was working something out. She was reading a book with a dragon on the cover and had been working her way through a hot chocolate with the focused dedication of someone who understood that pleasure was not a thing to rush. Ethan was on his second coffee and reading the week's edition of the county paper, which was mostly town council disputes and one story about a black bear that had gotten into the high school's dumpsters. Ordinary. Deliberately, carefully ordinary. He had built this life piece by piece after Sarah died. After the Navy, after the therapist he'd seen for 8 months, and then stopped seeing because he ran out of things he was willing to say. After the year he didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night and got by on black coffee and the specific discipline of having a child who depended on him to still be functional. He had found Millbrook because a man he'd served with had mentioned it once, said it was quiet, said people minded their own business. He had bought a small house with the kind of problems he knew how to fix. He had gotten his contractor's license and built a steady client base through the one quality people trusted most in a contractor. He showed up when he said he would. He was not happy, exactly, but he had learned that happy was sometimes a goal better replaced by something more achievable. He had Lily. He had his Saturday mornings. He had work that made sense in the way physical work made sense, where effort and result were directly connected, and there was no ambiguity about what you were supposed to do next. He was good at ordinary. He had worked very hard to become good at it. He was on the bear story when he heard the bell above the cafe door. He didn't look up immediately. He registered the door, a habit, not a choice, and filed it away without shifting his attention from the paper. 2 people entering. One set of footsteps uneven, deliberate, the other heavier, a few steps behind. It was only when Bet's voice changed that he actually looked. Bet had a lot of voices. There was her regular customer voice, warm and efficient, There was her stranger voice, cordial and cautious. There was the voice she used when she was telling a story she'd told 100 times, which rose and fell in the same places out of muscle memory. But there was another voice, one Ethan had never personally heard her use until now, that was flat and careful in the way a person's voice went flat when they were working very hard not to sound frightened. "Just the one order, sir, if you don't mind stepping to the side. I'm talking to her," the man said. Not loudly, low actually, which was sometimes worse. "This doesn't involve you." Ethan folded the paper. The woman the man was talking to was seated alone near the window, at the table closest to the door, the one positioned to leave enough space for the wheelchair she had arrived in, which was now set to the side of her chair with the precision of someone who'd been navigating other people's furniture her entire life. She was maybe 30, dark-haired, and she was looking at the man standing over her with an expression Ethan had seen before. Calm on the surface, working very hard to stay there, and losing the fight in increments. The man was a few years younger than Ethan, thick-necked, restless energy, wearing a jacket that had seen better days. He was leaning on the table with one hand, not threatening enough for anyone to call it threatening, which was probably intentional. "I told you," the woman said. Her voice was even, careful. "I don't know who you are. I'd like you to leave me alone." "You know exactly who I am." The man's voice dropped further. "Or you should. Because your company just put 43 people out of work right before Christmas, and one of them is my father, and I just want you to—" "Sir." Bet again, firmer now. "I'm going to have to ask you to— stay out of it." The cafe had gone very quiet, 6 other people in the room, and all of them had arrived at the same decision. Not their problem, don't get involved, look somewhere else. It was a human instinct, and Ethan didn't judge it. He'd just never been able to do it. He folded the newspaper and set it on top of Lily's book. "Don't move from this table," he told her quietly. Lily looked up. She saw his face, that particular stillness that had replaced whatever expression he normally wore, and she understood without being told that this was one of those moments. "Okay," she said. He stood up. He didn't cross the room fast. There was no point in fast. Fast was for when it was already physical, and it wasn't there yet. He walked at a pace that was just slightly more deliberate than casual, and he stopped about 4 feet from the man, which was far enough to not read as aggressive and close enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. "Hey," he said. The man turned. His eyes did a quick sweep, height, build, the scar that ran along Ethan's left forearm, and recalibrated whatever he'd been about to say. "What?" "I think the lady asked you to leave her alone." Ethan kept his voice the same way he kept his body. Settled, measured, nothing wound up that didn't need to be. "That's a pretty simple thing. This isn't your business." "Maybe not." Ethan glanced briefly at the woman. She was watching him with those careful eyes, assessing, not grateful, which he respected. She didn't know him either. "But I'm making it mine." The man stared at him for a moment. He was reading something in Ethan's face, or his posture, or the specific quality of his stillness that was making him recalculate. Men who started these kinds of confrontations were, in Ethan's experience, rarely ready for someone who didn't flinch. "You have no idea what she did," the man said. But some of the heat had gone out of it. "Probably true," Ethan said. "But whatever she did, this isn't the way. You know that." A long 5 seconds, the kind where everything could go either direction. Then the man straightened up, slow and deliberate in the way retreating people tried to make retreating look like a choice. He looked at the woman once more, a look that carried things Ethan couldn't fully read but didn't like, and then he walked to the door and pushed it open and was gone. The bell above the door rang twice. The cafe exhaled. Betty put her hand flat on the counter and breathed out. The other customers gradually resumed the appearance of having been elsewhere. Ethan looked at the woman. "Sorry about that," he said, which wasn't exactly the right thing. He hadn't caused it, but it was the thing he had. She looked at him for a moment with those gray, dark eyes, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't quite name, somewhere between wariness and the very reluctant beginning of something that might, eventually, become gratitude. "I didn't need saving," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." A pause. "But thank you." He nodded and went back to his table. Her name was Victoria Langford, and Ethan didn't know that yet. He found out later, not that morning, not from the confrontation, but in pieces over time, the way you found out things about people in a small town where everyone knew most things and kept the rest to themselves out of a courtesy that passed for community. He found out she was new to Millbrook, that she'd been coming up on weekends from Boston, staying at a place she was renting on the north side of town, that she ran a company, something in tech, or adjacent to tech, the way a lot of companies were now, straddling categories that hadn't existed 10 years ago. He found out she used a wheelchair sometimes and didn't others, which he noted without comment because it wasn't his to comment on. He found out she had a reputation for being the kind of CEO people either admired or resented without much middle ground. That the thing with the man at the cafe, the layoffs the man had mentioned, was real. 43 jobs, real people with real problems, and that the full story was apparently more complicated than grief and anger usually allowed for. He didn't go looking for any of this. It came to him the way information always came in places like Millbrook, through Betty at the cafe and his neighbor Frank and a general contractor named Rubio who had done some work on the rental property Victoria was staying at and couldn't stop talking about the quality of the accessible modifications she'd had installed. Ethan listened without encouraging, the way he'd learned to navigate information, taking what was useful, setting the rest aside. What he noted from that morning at Carver's was the way she'd held herself during the confrontation. The man had been standing over her, and she'd sat in her chair without leaning back, without making herself smaller, with a quality of uprightness that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with a decision she'd apparently made at some point about how she was going to meet difficulty when it arrived. He'd seen that quality in people before. It was not common. He didn't think much more about it than that. He had learned, carefully, deliberately, not to let his mind run ahead of his life. The following Saturday, he was back at Carver's with Lily. Victoria was there again. Same window table. A laptop this time, and a cup of something that steamed. She looked up when he came in, recognized him with a brief nod, and went back to her screen. He ordered his coffee. Lily got another hot chocolate, plus a scone she had been negotiating for since they left the house. They settled at their regular table. About 20 minutes in, he became aware that someone was standing outside on the sidewalk, not moving, not looking at the hardware store or the bookshop, just standing, at the angle where you could see through the cafe window without being directly in front of it. Ethan looked once, steadily, without shifting his body. The man from the previous Saturday had been thick-necked, restless. This was someone else, thinner, still, wearing a dark coat with the collar up against the cold. He was looking at the window, and then he looked directly at Ethan, and for a half-second they held eye contact through the glass. Then the man turned and walked away. It was nothing. It could have been nothing. Ethan set down his coffee and spent the next several minutes pretending to read the paper while his mind, quietly and without drama, began doing what it had been trained to do. Exits. 2. Front door, kitchen rear. The window was plate glass, which was breakable in an emergency but not useful as an exit unless circumstances were very bad. Sightlines from the street were partially obscured by the cafe's awning. The parking lot was visible through the east-facing window. His truck was third from the left. He wasn't the kind of man who spiraled. He didn't catastrophize. He had learned the hard way in the specific school where lessons cost real things that the difference between readiness and paranoia was whether you let it consume your daily functioning. He noted it, filed it, returned his attention to Lily, who was reading her dragon book and periodically making small sounds of either outrage or satisfaction at whatever was happening in it. "You okay?" she asked without looking up. He looked at her. "Yeah. Why?" "You've been staring at the parking lot for like 4 minutes." He let out a breath. "Eat your scone." She did, but she gave him the look. Sarah's look. The one that said she wasn't fooled and wasn't going to say so, and he let it go because there was nothing to say yet. Maybe nothing to say at all. Outside, the sidewalk was empty. The snow from the week before had turned to gray slush at the curb and refrozen overnight into the specific ugly permanence of November in New England. A truck went past on Elm Street. A woman walked a dog. The hardware store's open sign flickered once and went still. Ordinary. Deliberately, carefully ordinary. Ethan drank his coffee and watched the door and said nothing. He got home that afternoon, put Lily to work on her homework, and went down to the workshop he'd built in the half-basement where he did the detail work for his contracting jobs. The trim pieces, the custom shelving, the things that required patience and a steady hand, and the kind of focused attention that kept everything else quiet. He worked until 6. Lily came down at 5:45 to tell him she was hungry and had finished her math, in that order of priority. He made eggs and toast because it was what they had, and they ate at the kitchen table, and Lily told him about a project her social studies teacher had assigned that she thought was stupid but might be interesting. She wasn't sure yet. He did the dishes while she finished a chapter of her book. He was fine. Everything was fine. But before he went to bed, he went to the closet in his bedroom, past the hanging shirts, past the shelf where he kept Sarah's old sweater that he hadn't been able to throw away, and he put his hand on the small safe in the back corner and stood there for a moment. He didn't open it. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while, listening to the house settle, listening to the quiet outside where there was nothing but wind off the hills and the occasional distant sound of a car on the county road. Safe sounds, known sounds. He thought about a man standing on a sidewalk, looking through a window, and then walking away. He thought about a confrontation in a cafe that had resolved too easily. Men like that rarely back down so cleanly, which meant either he'd read it wrong or the man had wanted something other than a confrontation. He thought about a word he'd spent 6 years trying to stop thinking in. Threat assessment. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up briefly, moved through the trees at the edge of the property, and settled again into silence. Millbrook at night was very quiet. Ethan Cross had learned not to trust quiet. The week after the man on the sidewalk, nothing happened. That was the part Ethan hadn't expected. He'd spent 6 years getting good at ordinary, and in that time he'd also gotten good at distinguishing between the kind of nothing that was actually nothing and the kind of nothing that was a held breath. This was the second kind. He could feel it the way you felt weather before it arrived. Not a specific sensation, just a change in the quality of the air, something slightly wrong in the pressure of the day. He went to work. He finished a kitchen renovation in Concord that had been running 3 weeks over schedule because the homeowner kept changing his mind about the cabinet hardware. He picked Lily up from school on Tuesday when her ride fell through. He made dinner 4 nights out of 7, which was his usual average, and let Lily make cereal the other 3 because she had decided at some point that cereal for dinner was a personal freedom she was entitled to, and he hadn't found a compelling argument against it. He drove past Carver's twice during the week, not stopping, just passing slowly enough to look. Nothing unusual, Betty's lights on, a few cars in the lot, normal. He told himself he was being careful. He knew the difference between careful and anxious, and he knew which one was useful. On Thursday, he found the note. It was under the windshield wiper of his truck, parked in front of the hardware store where he'd gone to pick up sealant for the Concord job. A folded piece of paper, the ordinary kind, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. He unfolded it, standing on the sidewalk in the cold, and read the 5 words written on it in block letters, unhurried and precise. I remember your face, Cross. He stood there for a moment. The wind came down the street and lifted the corner of the paper, and he folded it again and put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at the street both ways. Foot traffic, one couple walking a dog, a teenager on a phone. Nobody looking at him. Nobody not looking at him in the way that meant they were. He bought his sealant. He drove home. He sat in the truck in his driveway for a long time before going inside. He called a man named Garrett Foley that evening, after Lily was in bed. Foley was the closest thing Ethan had to someone who knew the full shape of his past, a former SEAL himself, now working private security consulting out of Virginia, one of those people you stayed in contact with not because the friendship was easy, but because certain histories created a kind of bond that was harder to explain than to honor. They talked maybe once every 2 or 3 months. The calls were usually short and mostly practical. This one was different. Someone left a note on my truck, Ethan said, without preamble, because Foley was not a man who required preamble. My name, Block letters. Said they remember my face. A pause on the line. Local dispute? Contractor thing? No, I had a thing last week at a cafe. Stepped in when a man was harassing a woman. He backed off cleaner than he should have. He paused. Different man on the sidewalk after. Watching. You think they're connected? I don't know. But I'm not a man people have reasons to come after here. I'm a contractor. I've been a contractor for 5 years. He stopped. The only people who'd use my last name like that are people who knew you before, Foley said. Yeah. Another pause, longer. You remember the op in 2017, Kalani Valley? Ethan was quiet for a moment. He remembered. He'd spent considerable effort not remembering, which was different from forgetting. What about it? Marcus Voss died on that op. I know that. You know his brother? I know he had one. Never met him. Ethan pressed his hand flat against the kitchen table. You're telling me something. I'm telling you I heard something a few months back through a contact. Marcus's younger brother, Damien, did a stretch in county for aggravated assault, got out maybe 8-9 months ago. He was making noise before he went in, about Marcus, about the op, about people he held responsible. Foley let that sit. I didn't think it was actionable. I probably should have mentioned it anyway. You probably should have, Ethan said. Not angry, just honest. Yeah. A breath. Is Lily safe? The question landed in his chest like something physical. She's home. She's fine. He said it with a certainty he was mostly working to manufacture. I need to know what you know about Damien Voss. I'll send you what I have. It's not much. A pause. Ethan, this guy, if it's him, he's not stable. The assault charge wasn't a bar fight. He targeted someone specifically, planned it. Okay. That means he's patient, and patient is harder than angry. I know. He did know. He'd learned it from the same places Foley had learned it, in the specific classrooms where lessons were measured in outcomes rather than grades. He hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, listening to the house. Upstairs, Lily's light was still on. She read too late every night, something he corrected every morning with diminishing conviction because he remembered doing the same thing at her age and his parents' objections hadn't changed anything. He thought about Marcus Voss. It wasn't a memory he'd ever been comfortable with, and it wasn't one he went to voluntarily. Marcus had been 26, from somewhere in Oklahoma, serious and capable, and the kind of soldier you were glad to have beside you in the situations where glad wasn't exactly the right word, but was the closest available. He'd died because of a decision Ethan had made during a classified operation, in conditions that the people who classified such things had decided the public didn't need to understand. It had been the right decision given the intelligence available. It had also gotten a man killed. Those two things could both be true, and often were, and never got any easier to hold. He thought about a younger brother who'd grown up with that, who'd been told what, and maybe given the sanitized version of how, and who'd built something from it over years, not grief exactly, or not only grief, but the specific architecture of a mind that had decided someone owed a debt that couldn't be paid any other way. Patient, Foley had said, and Ethan believed it. Don't. He picked up Lily from school the next day himself, even though she normally took the bus. She came out of the building in the middle of a group of her friends, mid-conversation about something that required a lot of hand gestures, and she saw his truck and her face shifted through 3 expressions quickly: surprise, calculation, a brief flicker of the same look Sarah used to give him when she was deciding whether to ask a direct question or wait him out. She got in the truck and said, "You never pick me up on Fridays. Thought I'd come get you. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine." He pulled out of the school lot. "How was your day?" She looked at him for a moment with those green-gray eyes. "My day was normal, Dad. What's going on?" "Nothing you need to worry about." That's not an answer. He stopped at the light on Cedar and looked at her properly. She was 12, and sometimes that felt young and sometimes it did not. Her mother had been the same, the kind of person who took you seriously whether or not you'd earned it yet. "There's something from a long time ago that I might need to deal with. I don't know yet. I'm being careful." He paused. I need you to be careful too. Stay with your group at school, don't go anywhere alone after dark, and if anything feels weird, you call me immediately. Don't wait. Lily looked at him for a long time. Is this a military thing? The light changed. He drove. It might be. She was quiet for a moment. Then, okay. Just that. Okay. No drama, no interrogation. She had always had a quality, maybe inherited, maybe learned, of being able to accept difficult things without needing them to be softened. He didn't know whether to be grateful for it or to worry about what it meant. Okay, he said back, and they drove the rest of the way home in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. He ran into Victoria Langford at the hardware store on Saturday morning, not Carver's, where he'd skipped their regular routine because he wasn't yet sure whether the cafe had been chosen deliberately as a location, which was the kind of thing a patient man would do. He'd sent Lily to a friend's house for the morning with the explanation that he had errands, which was true, but not complete. Victoria was in the accessibility aisle, which the hardware store had started stocking after the town had put in new regulations. She was in the wheelchair today, frowning at a set of door handle hardware with the focused concentration of someone who had strong opinions about door handles. He would have kept going, but she looked up. The contractor, she said. He stopped. Ethan. I know. She looked back at the hardware. These lever handles are listed as ADA compliant, which technically they are, and they're also completely useless for anyone with limited grip strength, which tells you exactly how much the people who write ADA standards understand about actual daily use. He looked at the handles. Then he reached past her and took a different set off the shelf. Wider grip, different lever angle, matte finish. These are better. More torque for less effort. I've installed them at 2 properties. She took them from him and examined them. These aren't listed as compliant. They meet the spec. The listing's just behind. He paused. For your rental? For a project. She handed the package back. And yes, also for the rental. She stopped, something shifting in her expression. Someone got into the rental last week, didn't take anything, just moved things, small things, enough that I knew someone had been there. But the cold that moved through him was not about the temperature in the store. Did you report it? To who? The local police. I called. They sent someone, looked around, wrote a report. She said it without bitterness, just the flat precision of someone who dealt with institutional inadequacy before and adjusted their expectations accordingly. Nothing was taken. No sign of forced entry, which means either I forgot to lock something or whoever it was knew what they were doing. She looked at him. Do you know anyone who might have a reason to watch me? The question was direct enough that it stopped him. Why do you ask me that? Because the man from the cafe last weekend, the one you stepped in with, I saw him again, Wednesday, outside the coffee shop where I was having a meeting in Concord, just standing, the way people stand when they want you to see them. She held his gaze. And you've been doing that thing today, the way you came in, the way you positioned yourself by that shelf. You're watching the door. He was. He hadn't thought he was being obvious. I'm a contractor. I look at how buildings are put together. You're looking at who comes through the door, she said, not how it's hinged. He held her gaze for a moment, and in it he made a decision that felt like it might be a mistake, and also felt, in the specific, uncomfortable way of necessary things, like the only real option. There's a coffee place on 3rd Street, not Carver's. Could you give me 20 minutes? She looked at him for a moment. 20 minutes, she said. Yeah. He told her the minimum. He was deliberate about that, not because he didn't think she could handle more, but because the minimum was what was verifiably true, and he'd spent too long in environments where people filled gaps with inference, and inference had a way of becoming certainty. He told her that the man from the cafe might be connected to his military past, that he was monitoring the situation, that the note on his truck and the apparent break-in at her rental suggested someone was trying to build pressure from multiple angles, rather than confront him directly. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup on the table. You're telling me I'm in this because of you, she said. That's what I think, yes. Because you stepped in. Because I stepped in. He paused. I'm sorry. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I was already on his radar. The confrontation at the cafe wasn't random. He was there because I was there. You changed the dynamic, but you didn't create it. She looked at him steadily. Does that distinction help you? He thought about it honestly. Somewhat. Good. She set her cup down. What are you going to do? I have people looking into who he is. I have a name, probably. I'm waiting to confirm it before I do anything that commits me to a direction. And in the meantime? In the meantime, I'm careful, and I'm asking you to be careful. He paused. I know you don't know me. I know you have no particular reason to trust my read on this. You were right about the door handles, she said. It was said so flatly, so without humor, that it took him a moment to realize it was meant to be something like a joke. He exhaled. That's a low bar. Most things are when you think about it. She looked out the window at 3rd Street, where the ordinary machinery of a small-town Saturday was going about its business. A couple with a stroller, an old man walking with considerable dignity, a kid on a bike who clearly shouldn't have been on that sidewalk. I'm not going to stop my life because someone wants me to be afraid. I'm not asking you to. You're asking me to be careful. Yes, I can do careful, she said. I've been doing careful my whole life. I'm very good at it. Something in her voice made that more complicated than it sounded. What I'm not going to do is disappear. He nodded. He understood that. He'd made the same decision in different circumstances more than once. The decision that living reduced, living smaller, living in a crouch wasn't really living at all. It was just surviving with extra steps. Okay, he said. Then we're on the same page. She looked at him with those direct gray eyes. We barely know each other. No, he agreed. We don't. But you came and told me. You deserve to know. Another quiet moment. She picked up her coffee. I have a question. Okay. The operation, the one from your past. She said it carefully, not pushing, just opening a door. Did you do something wrong? He held her gaze. I made a decision. A man died because of it. Whether that's wrong depends on what you think a decision is accountable for, and there isn't a clean answer to that. He paused. His brother thinks there is. Victoria was quiet for a moment. That's a hard thing to carry. Most things that matter are. She didn't respond to that, which was the right call, because there wasn't anything to add to it. They sat with it for a moment, two people who'd each been carrying their own version of difficult things long enough to recognize the shape of someone else's burden. So, the confirmation came from Foley on Tuesday. Damien Voss, 31 years old, last known address in Manchester, outstanding on a probation check-in he'd missed 3 weeks ago. His record: the assault charge, 2 prior disorderlies, a firearms violation that had been pleaded down. No confirmed employment since his release. And a photograph. Ethan looked at it on his phone screen for a long time. Thin face, dark eyes, the specific quality of stillness in the expression that didn't come from calm, but from something collapsed. A person who'd stopped expecting good outcomes so completely that it had changed how he held his face. He was the man from the sidewalk. Ethan put the phone down and sat with that for a while. The man had stood outside the cafe and looked through the window at him. Had broken into Victoria's rental and moved small things around, not to find anything, not to take anything, but to communicate something. I can get in. I'm already inside your life. This is what I can reach. Foley had said patient was harder than angry. He was right. Angry people acted on impulse, and impulse could be predicted, and prediction could be managed. Patient people were building something step by step with a specific endpoint in mind, and the endpoint here was not hard to read. Damien Voss didn't want to hurt Ethan, or not only that, he wanted Ethan to lose someone the way he had lost someone. He wanted it to mean something. He wanted Ethan to carry what Damien had been carrying for the better part of a decade. That was not something Ethan was going to let happen. He called a man he knew in the county sheriff's department, a deputy named Calhoun, who owed him a professional favor from a prior situation that Ethan had handled quietly and without making Calhoun's life difficult in the process. He gave Calhoun enough context to make the situation legible without giving him enough to make it complicated. A man with a criminal record, a missed probation check-in, a pattern of behavior that suggested escalation, a specific name, and a specific photograph. "You want us to pick him up?" Calhoun asked. "I want you to know he exists," Ethan said. "I want his probation officer contacted about the missed check-in. And I want you to know that if something happens in this town, he's the name to start with." "That's playing it pretty conservative." "For now," Ethan said. He didn't explain the rest of it, which was this: picking Damien up right now on a probation violation and a trespassing charge that would be nearly impossible to prove without Victoria willing to press it formally, would accomplish nothing except making Damien more careful. And more careful was the last thing Ethan needed him to be. He needed to understand the whole shape of it, what Damien wanted, how far he was willing to go, whether he was working alone. Patient, Foley had said. Ethan Cross had been patient before, in worse places, with worse stakes, with less sleep and fewer options. He could be patient again. 3 days later, Lily came home from school and told him, in the completely offhand way that children deliver devastating information, that a man had talked to her outside the school. She'd been waiting for Madison's mom to pick them both up because their plans had run late, and Madison was inside getting her bag, and a man in a dark coat had stopped on the sidewalk and said he knew her dad. Ethan's blood went cold in a way he recognized and had learned to stay functional through. He kept his voice even. "What did he say?" "He said he and Dad were old friends. He said Dad would be happy to see him." She paused. "He was weird. His smile was weird, like it didn't go with his face." "Did he touch you?" "No, Madison's mom pulled up like a minute later and I got in the car." She looked at him. "Dad, who was he?" He looked at his daughter for a moment, at the 12-year-old who read dragon books and negotiated for scones and had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of seeing through him. The 12-year-old he had built 6 years of ordinary life to protect. "I don't know yet," he said, which was not quite a lie, but was the closest he was willing to come to one with her. "But I need you to hear me, okay? Really hear me." She straightened. "I'm listening." "You don't go anywhere alone. Not for school, not for anything. If a plan changes, you call me before you move. If someone approaches you, anyone, you walk away and you call me. You don't stay to be polite. You don't wait to see if they mean something. You move first and ask later." He held her gaze. "You understand me?" "Yes." No argument, no teenage pushback. She'd looked at his face and understood. "Dad, are we safe?" He put his hand on her shoulder. "I'm working on it," he said. "That's what I'm doing right now." It wasn't yes, but she held it without flinching, because she was her mother's daughter, and she'd inherited whatever it was that made Sarah able to stand in difficult truths without needing them to be made smaller. "Okay," she said. "Do you want me to set the table, or—" "Yeah," he said. "Set the table." She went to the kitchen. He stood in the hallway for a moment, his hand still raised from where it had been on her shoulder, and he breathed out slowly through his nose and felt something settle in him that wasn't calm exactly, but was its functional equivalent, the place past fear where clarity lived, where the noise stopped and the shape of things became visible. Damien Voss had talked to his daughter. Whatever patience Ethan had been practicing, whatever careful, measured distance he'd been keeping, that was over now. He was done waiting to understand the full shape of it. He understood it already. Damien wanted him to feel what helplessness felt like. Wanted him on the back foot, reactive, emotional, making decisions from fear rather than from thought. Wanted to peel away everything Ethan had built until what was left was the soldier who'd made the call in 2017 and paid for it in someone else's blood. Ethan went to the kitchen. He watched Lily set the table with the practiced efficiency of a kid who'd been doing her own chores since she was 8 because her father believed in it, and he started making dinner, and he kept his hands steady and his voice normal, and inside the quiet machinery of his mind he began to build something. Not a response. A plan. Because the one thing Damien Voss had gotten wrong, the one miscalculation that would, in the end, matter most, was the assumption that pushing Ethan Cross into soldier mode was a threat. It wasn't. It was a mistake. The plan took 4 days to build and another 2 to stress test, which was how Ethan worked, not because he was indecisive, but because he'd learned, in the specific and expensive education of his former life, that the difference between a plan and a wish was the number of failure points you'd identified before you needed to act on it. He told Calhoun more this time. Not everything, but enough. Damien's approach to Lily outside the school, the missed probation check-in, the photograph Foley had sent. Calhoun was not an excitable man, which was one of the reasons Ethan had called him first 6 years ago when he'd moved to Millbrook and decided he needed to understand who the local law enforcement was and whether they were worth trusting. The answer, in Calhoun's case, was a qualified yes. He was practical, he was not political, and he understood that some situations required a kind of cooperation that didn't fit neatly into official procedure. "You're going to draw him out," Calhoun said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to give him what he's been building toward," Ethan said. "A direct confrontation. On ground I choose. And you want us positioned before he gets there. 2 units, unmarked. 1 covering the north access, 1 on the county road. I want them in place 2 hours before I go in." He paused. "I also need you to know about a secondary concern." He told Calhoun about Victoria, about the pattern, the cafe, the rental break-in, the way Damien had been applying pressure from multiple angles, about the fact that a man building toward something didn't build only one path toward it. Calhoun was quiet for a moment. "You think he'll move on her at the same time?" "He's been patient. He's had a specific endpoint in mind from the beginning. If his goal is to force me to lose someone..." Ethan stopped. "He's not going to just wait for me at a warehouse and hope the math works out. He's going to hedge it." "You want someone on her location." "I want someone on her location the entire time I'm in that building." Another pause. "Ethan, you're putting a lot of pieces on the board here. If any of them move wrong..." "I know." He did know. He'd run the scenarios enough times to understand where each one frayed. The problem with involving law enforcement in something like this was the same problem with most coordinated efforts. The more people involved, the more variables you couldn't control. But the alternative, going in alone, trusting that Damien's focus would stay entirely on him while Victoria was unprotected, was not a scenario he was willing to run. "My daughter's with a family in Concord," he said. "She's been there since Tuesday. Doesn't know the address. I drove her in a rental. The family knows not to open the door for anyone they don't recognize." He said it flatly, because it was flat. The specific flatness of something that had cost him something to arrange. Lily had understood, mostly. She'd asked him twice if he was going to be okay. He'd told her he intended to be. She'd given him the look and said that wasn't a yes, and he'd said it was the best he had right now, and she'd hugged him at the door of the Concord house with a grip that was stronger than a 12-year-old's grip should have needed to be. He was not going to think about that right now. "Tell me about the building," Calhoun said. The warehouse was on the eastern edge of Millbrook, off a county road that had stopped being regularly maintained sometime in the previous decade. It had been a furniture distribution center through most of the 90s, and had changed hands twice since, the last time to a holding company that apparently held it for the pure bureaucratic pleasure of holding things, because no one had operated out of it in at least 4 years. The windows on the ground level had been boarded, and 2 of the boards had been recently pried loose and replaced imprecisely, which was how Ethan knew Damien had been there. He'd done the reconnaissance himself twice, on 2 different days and at 2 different times of day, on foot, and with enough distance to not be visible from the building. The structure was 2 stories, the second floor mostly open loft space, 2 staircases, 1 at either end of the main floor, and 3 entry points. The main loading dock on the south face, a personnel door on the east side, and a fire exit on the north end that had been chained from the outside with a padlock that looked new against the rust of everything around it. New padlock on the north exit meant Damien had put it there, which meant he didn't want easy exit from that end. Which meant the ambush, when it came, was designed to funnel movement toward the south and east, toward the doors Damien would be covering. Ethan noted it, filed it, moved it to the column of things that were useful. He also noted the structural features of the second-floor loft, partial flooring, exposed beams, sight lines that ran the length of the building. If Damien wasn't alone, The loft was where a second person would position. Good angle on both staircases and most of the ground floor. Limited coverage of the northwest corner where a loading alcove created a dead zone in the sightlines. He noted that too. He called Victoria on Wednesday evening, the night before. She picked up on the second ring. "Is this the part where you tell me to leave town?" she said, without greeting. "No." He paused. "I need to tell you what's happening tomorrow. And I need to ask you something." He told her the outline, the warehouse, the coordination with Calhoun, the secondary concern about her location. She listened with the same quality she'd had in the cafe on the day of the confrontation, and at the coffee shop when he'd explained Damien's history, and every time since that they'd talked, which had been more often than either of them had formally acknowledged. Complete attention, no interrupting, and a quality of processing that was faster than it appeared because by the time she responded, she'd already worked through most of it. "You want me to stay at the rental," she said. "I want you to stay at the rental with a deputy outside. Calhoun's placing someone at 7. I go to the warehouse at 9. "What's the deputy's name?" The question caught him slightly off guard. "Mendez. Renata Mendez. 8 years on the force. Calhoun says she's good." "Okay?" A pause. "Are you going to be all right?" The question landed differently than he expected. Not "are you sure about this" or "do you have enough backup," which were the practical questions, but the actual human question underneath them. He sat with it for a second before answering. "I'm going in prepared, with law enforcement in position and coordination in place. The odds are reasonable." "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been in worse rooms," he said. "That's also not what I asked." He looked at the wall of his kitchen, at the calendar Lily kept on the refrigerator with her school events marked in 3 different colors because she'd decided a single color was insufficient to convey the relative importance of things. "I intend to come back," he said. "That's what I've got." A long moment of quiet on the line, then, "Okay." The same word Lily used, carrying the same weight, acceptance without pretending something wasn't difficult. "Ethan." "Yeah." "Don't do anything that's about anger. Whatever you feel when you walk in there, don't let it be about what he did with Lily. That's what he wants from you." He breathed in slowly. "I know." "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." "I hear you," he said. And he did. He arrived at the warehouse at 8:52. He parked the truck a quarter mile down the county road behind a stand of bare-limbed birch trees that gave him cover and gave him walking distance, which was not nothing. The approach on foot meant he arrived quieter and with his senses already calibrated to the space rather than transitioning out of the vehicle noise and warmth at the last moment. The night was cold. Clear sky, no cloud cover, which meant good visibility in the open and reasonable visibility inside if there was any ambient light coming through the gaps in the boarded windows. He was dressed practically. Dark layers, boots he'd resoled in October, nothing that caught or snagged. He had his phone on silent in his left jacket pocket. In his right jacket pocket, folded, was the printed photograph of Damien Voss, which he'd looked at enough times by now that the image was in his memory, but which he'd brought anyway out of the habit of keeping physical evidence available. He also had, holstered at his hip under the jacket, the sidearm from the safe in his bedroom closet, which he'd cleaned and loaded on Tuesday and had been carrying since Wednesday morning. He had a license and he had cause. He hoped not to use it. He confirmed with Calhoun by text at 8:55. 2 units in position, Mendez confirmed on Victoria's location, acknowledged. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the warehouse. The building was dark mostly. There was a faint light somewhere inside, barely visible through the gap in one of the boarded ground floor windows, the kind of light that came from a single lantern or a phone screen or something equally minimal. Enough to see by if you were already inside. Not enough to signal your position to someone approaching from outside. Amateur mistake, Ethan thought, and then reconsidered. Or a deliberate signal. "I'm here. Come in." He moved around the perimeter, staying 40 feet from the building's face, using the scrub brush and the dead grass and the natural contours of the lot for cover out of pure habit rather than necessity. There was nobody watching from outside, or nobody he could detect, which was not quite the same thing. He checked the north exit, padlock still in place. He checked the east personnel door. Unlocked, the handle sitting slightly proud of the frame the way a door sat when someone had come through it recently and not bothered to fully close it. He stood at the east door for 30 seconds. Listened. Inside. Silence, mostly. The specific silence of an empty building, ambient noise, settling structure, the faint movement of air through the gaps in the boards. And underneath it, barely there, the sound of something that might have been a person breathing or might have been the building itself doing what old buildings did. He pushed the door open with his left hand and stepped inside. The main floor of this warehouse was large and mostly empty. Bare concrete, a few old wooden pallets stacked against the south wall. The ghost of racking systems and the rusted bolt patterns on the floor where shelving had been removed. The ambient light was coming from upstairs, filtering down through the gaps in the loft flooring. Ethan registered it, noted the staircase on his right leading up, noted the loading dock ahead and to his left, noted the northwest alcove, the dead zone in the sightlines, about 30 feet ahead. He did not head for the staircase. He moved left, keeping close to the wall, using the building's own shadow, and he moved toward the northwest alcove at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried because hurrying now would be the wrong instinct. He heard Damien before he saw him. "I figured you'd come through the east door." The voice came from above, second floor, midway along the loft, which was approximately where Ethan had calculated a person would position for coverage. Calm voice. Quiet. The flatness of someone who'd rehearsed what they wanted to say for long enough that the emotion had worn thin. "You always liked the side entry. Marcus told me that. Said you never came through the front." Ethan stopped walking. He was in the alcove now, out of the direct sightline from the loft, and he spoke toward the ceiling without raising his voice. "Damien." A pause. "You know my name. I've known your name for 2 weeks." Footsteps above. Slow, moving along the loft toward the staircase at the far south end. Ethan tracked the sound. One person. One set of footsteps. Which meant either Damien was alone, possible but not the scenario Ethan was betting on, or the second person was staying very still. "Then you know why I'm here," Damien said. "I know what you think you're here for," Ethan said. "I'm not sure you know the difference between that and what's actually happening." The footsteps stopped. A long pause. "What's actually happening is that you're going to understand what it felt like. When the call came, when someone told me my brother was dead because of a decision some officer made in a room Marcus shouldn't have been in. The voice was still flat, but there was something moving under it. Not heat exactly, more like pressure, like something that had been compressed for a long time and was beginning to test the walls of wherever it was being kept. Marcus was 26. He had a girl he was going to marry. He had a stop, a breath. You understand that? He had a whole life that didn't happen because of you." Ethan stood in the dark of the alcove with that. "I know," he said. Silence from above. "I have thought about Marcus Voss," Ethan continued, "more times than I can count, for nearly a decade. Not because anyone required it of me, because it was true." He paused. "I made a call. Given the intelligence I had, it was the right call. Marcus died anyway. Both of those things are true and they don't cancel each other out, and I'm not going to tell you they do." More silence. The footsteps above resumed, slower now, thoughtful. "That's supposed to do something," Damien said. "You acknowledging it?" "No, it's not supposed to do anything. It's just what's true." "You don't get to—" A stop. When the voice came back, it was rougher. "You don't get to just say it and have it be enough. You don't get to just live your life, your daughter, your—" A sharp breath. "You have everything Marcus should have had. You have all of it." "I had a wife who died of cancer when my daughter was 6, Ethan said. Flat. Not for effect, just because it was true and Damien clearly hadn't known it, and leaving that particular gap unfilled felt wrong. "I know what loss is. Not the same loss you have, but I know what it is." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Longer. Less controlled. Then, from somewhere in the right half of the building, not above, not from the loft, a sound. Not Damien. Too far left for Damien's position. A shuffle, a small adjustment, the sound of someone shifting their weight in the dark. There it was. Ethan didn't move. He kept his voice directed upward toward Damien. You brought someone else. A pause from above. Insurance. Where are they? Don't worry about that. Damien. He kept his voice even. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it. Law enforcement is already outside this building, 2 units on the county road and north access, in position since 7 o'clock. Whatever your insurance is, it's covered. He paused. This is over. The only question now is how it ends. A long silence. Then from Damien, above. You're lying. I'm not. Call it if you want. Go to the door and look. Ethan stayed still. I came in here to talk to you, that's all. I came in here because you've been building toward this for 10 years, and you've had nobody who would actually stand across from you and let you say it, and that... He stopped. Said it carefully. That's something you deserve that nobody gave you. I'm here now. Say what you need to say. Another long silence. Then, from the left side of the building, from wherever the second person was, a voice. Male. Younger. Uncertain in a way Damien's voice was not. Damien, man, he's not... We talked about this. If there's cops outside... Shut up, Damien said. I'm serious. I didn't sign up for... I said, shut up, Ryan. Ryan. A name. Young voice. Scared voice. Not a soldier, not a professional, someone Damien had recruited locally, probably with money or a story, someone who was now doing the math and not liking the results. Ryan, Ethan said, directing his voice toward the left side of the building. There's a door to the east, personnel door, it's unlocked. You walk out that door right now and nothing that happened tonight has your name on it. He kept his voice completely level. You've got about 30 seconds to decide. Silence. Then footsteps, fast from the left, crossing toward the east wall, and the sound of the personnel door opening and closing. One person left in the building. So, Damien came down the south staircase. Ethan heard him, not running, not stealthy, just walking with the particular weight of a man who'd made a decision about something and had stopped trying to hold multiple possibilities at once. Ethan stepped out of the alcove and into the open floor as Damien reached the bottom of the stairs. He looked worse than the photograph. Thinner, something wrong with the skin around his jaw, a quality of effort in the way he was holding himself upright that had nothing to do with posture. He stopped about 15 feet away. In his right hand was a hunting knife, held down at his side with the looseness of someone who'd been holding it long enough that it had become part of his grip rather than a deliberate choice. Not raised, not threatening, technically, just present. Ethan didn't reach for his sidearm. He stood where he was, hands visible, weight settled. You brought cops, Damien said. I brought help, Ethan said, because I was coming in here regardless and I'm not suicidal. Something in Damien's face shifted, not quite a laugh, more like a recognition. You're not scared. I didn't say that. You're just... Damien stopped, looked at him with those collapsed eyes. You came anyway. Yes. Why? Not challenging. Genuinely asking, the way a man asked when he'd run out of the thing that had been sustaining him and what was left was the actual question underneath it. Why would you could have just sent cops. You could have had them pick me up. Why are you here? Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Because you're Marcus's brother, he said. Because whatever I owe him, I owe you the courtesy of not hiding behind a badge when I explain it.
Amos.
Damien's face did something then. Something that was not a breakdown and not a resolution, and was closer to both of those things than anything in between. His jaw worked. He looked at the floor. The knife at his side was completely still. He was a stop, a breath. He used to call me every Sunday from wherever he was deployed, every Sunday, no matter what. If he couldn't call, he found a way to text, just so I'd know he was still another stop. I haven't had a Sunday in 9 years that felt like a normal Sunday. You understand that? 9 years. I understand, Ethan said. You can't understand it. No, not the same way. He held the man's gaze. But I know what it is to lose someone and keep waking up anyway. I know how much work that is. And I know what it does to a person when the grief doesn't have anywhere to go except towards someone to blame. Damien was quiet. You've been spending yourself on this for a long time, Ethan said. I can see it. You look like a man who's been running on hate because it was the only fuel left. He paused. That's a hell of a way to spend a decade. Something cracked in Damien's face. Not the way things cracked when they broke. More like the way ice cracked in spring, signaling the thing beneath it beginning to move. I have cancer, he said. Flat, like he'd run out of the energy to deliver it any particular way. Pancreatic, stage 3. They found it 4 months ago. A breath. The doctor said. He stopped again. I figured if I was going to go, I was going to go having done the one thing that still felt like it mattered. Ethan stood in that with him. Put the knife down, Damien, he said, quietly. A long moment. Damien looked at his own hand. He looked at the knife. The way you looked at something you'd picked up so long ago you'd forgotten you were still carrying it. Then he set it on the concrete floor, not dropping it, setting it, with a care that was almost ceremonial. He straightened up. He looked at Ethan with those exhausted eyes. What happens now? He said. Now I open the south door, Ethan said. And we walk out. And then Calhoun's people take you in. Probation violation, weapons charge, probably a few other things. He paused. It won't be comfortable. I won't pretend otherwise. No. Damien's voice was barely above the ambient noise of the building. I mean, what happens to the rest of it? Ethan understood what he was asking. It wasn't a legal question. I don't know, he said honestly. That's something you'll have to figure out, but it doesn't include this. He gestured at the building, at the night, at the whole shape of what they'd been doing. This is done. One way or another, you're done with this. Damien looked at him for a moment. Something in his face was different from how it had been when he'd come down the stairs. Not lighter exactly, more like the specific quality a face had after a long-held tension had finally released, even if nothing good had replaced it. I wanted you to feel it, he said. I wanted you to... A breath. I wanted it to cost you something. I know, Ethan said. Does it? A pause. Yes, Ethan said. It does. Not the way you planned, but yes. Outside, barely audible through the building's walls, a car moved on the county road. The ambient light from somewhere above them shifted as something moved in the wind. A board, a loose panel. And for a moment the whole space felt less solid, more like a thing that had been holding its breath and had finally stopped. Ethan crossed to the south loading dock door. He lifted the release bar. Cold air came in, and with it the dark shapes of the lot, the road, the tree line, and beyond it the faint illumination of Calhoun's units in position. He turned back. Damien was still standing in the middle of the floor, looking at the ground where he'd set the knife, at the knife itself, at something that wasn't visible. Damien, the man looked up. Walk out, Ethan said. A long moment passed. Then Damien Voss put one foot in front of the other and crossed the floor, and walked through the open door into the cold November night, and Ethan Cross followed him out. His phone was already buzzing. He checked it without breaking stride. Calhoun. All clear on north. Units moving in. And then, a second later, another text. From a number he recognized. From Mendez, Calhoun's deputy, who was stationed outside Victoria's rental on the north side of town. Attempted entry, rear of property. Male suspect detained. Ms. Langford is unharmed and secured. He stopped walking for half a second. Just half a second, long enough to let the full meaning of it, unharmed and secured, both words, both necessary, move through him and settle. Then he kept walking. Calhoun's people were coming across the lot. Damien was standing still, hands at his sides, looking at the sky, at the clear November sky with its ordinary and different stars, with an expression that Ethan couldn't fully read but which had stopped being the expression of a man with a destination. Ethan put his phone back in his pocket. He was cold and tired, and his hands were steady, and Lily was in Concord with people he trusted, and Victoria Langford was unharmed and in the wide and exhausting arithmetic of how nights like this were supposed to go. That was enough. That was more than enough. He stood in the cold and watched Calhoun's deputies cross the lot, and he breathed out slowly and didn't let himself feel relieved yet, because relief was for later, when all the pieces were confirmed and the night had fully resolved into something he could account for. But close. He let himself be close. The county sheriff's substation in Millbrook was a single-story building on the edge of town that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed functionality and comfort were mutually exclusive. Fluorescent lights, linoleum floors, the specific institutional smell of old coffee, and whatever cleaning product they used on the holding area. Ethan had been inside it twice before. Once when he'd first moved to town and introduced himself to the department as a professional courtesy, and once 2 years ago when a break-in at one of his job sites had required a statement. Both times he'd sat in the same plastic chair in the same narrow hallway and waited in the same quality of silence that government buildings generated, regardless of what was happening inside them. Tonight, the building had more people in it than usual. Calhoun was in the back processing Damien and coordinating with the detective who'd driven up from Concord when the probation violation and weapons charge had escalated into something requiring a higher tier of attention. Ryan, Damien's recruited accomplice, the young voice from the dark left side of the warehouse, had been picked up a quarter-mile down the county road, walking fast in the direction of town with his jacket inside out, in the way of someone who'd watched too many crime procedurals and believed that changed enough about his appearance to matter. He was 23, according to Calhoun, from Manchester, with no prior record and the specific look of a person who understood for the first time in his life what the actual consequences of a decision felt like. Mendez had brought the second detainee in from Victoria's rental. His name was Carl Pruitt, 41, with 2 prior assault charges and a connection to Damien that Calhoun's people were still working out. He'd come through the rear gate of Victoria's property with bolt cutters and a phone, and Mendez had been waiting in the dark of the back garden with a patience that Ethan respected enormously, and the whole thing had been over in under 90 seconds. Victoria had not been harmed. Ethan kept returning to that fact the way you return to something solid when everything else was still moving. He was sitting in the plastic chair in the hallway when she arrived. She came through the front door with Mendez behind her, and she was in the wheelchair, and she was wearing the same jacket she'd had on in the coffee shop on 3rd Street 2 weeks ago when he'd told her about Damien. Her face was composed, more composed than the situation probably warranted, which told him she'd had time in the car to get herself there. But her hands in her lap were gripping each other with a pressure that gave it away. She looked at him across the hallway and held his gaze for a moment without saying anything. Then she wheeled across and stopped about 3 feet away. "You're not hurt," she said. "No." "You look like you've been in a warehouse for an hour." "That's accurate." She looked at him for another moment with those gray eyes, doing whatever calculation she did when she was assessing a situation, and then she exhaled, one slow, controlled breath, and some of the grip in her hands loosened. "Okay," she said. "You're all right?" he asked. Mendez got there before he got through the back door. "I heard the gate, I called it in, and then I sat in the hallway of my rental with a kitchen knife and waited." A pause. "Which was terrifying, if we're being honest about it." "We can be honest about it." "Good. Because I'd like to not do that again." "Yeah," he said. "Me neither." They sat in the hallway side by side, Ethan in the plastic chair, Victoria in her chair beside him, while the machinery of the official process ground along somewhere behind the doors, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was fine. Some silences were comfortable, not because everything was resolved, but because the people inside them had stopped needing to fill them. After a while, Victoria said, "Is he going to be all right, the man from the warehouse?" Ethan looked at the wall. "He has cancer, stage 3. He told me tonight." He paused. "So no, probably not." She was quiet for a moment. She stopped. Started again. "That changes the shape of it." "It does." "He came all this way, built all of this." A pause. "Carrying all of that, and now it's over," Ethan said, "and he has to figure out what's left." "What did you say to him? In the warehouse?" He thought about how to answer that. "The truth," he said, "about Marcus, about the decision, About the fact that I've thought about it for 9 years. He paused. It wasn't enough. It couldn't be. But it was what I had. She looked at him sideways. Did it help? Saying it to him directly? He considered it honestly, the way she was clearly asking him to. Yeah, he said. A little. I didn't expect that. Things we don't expect to help often do, she said, and vice versa. He looked at her. Is that from somewhere? It's from about 15 years of being surprised by what does and doesn't work. She said it without self-pity, the way she said most things, direct, without the decoration that people sometimes added to difficult truths to soften them. I've spent a lot of time figuring out which fights were worth having and which ones just looked like they were from the outside. He thought about that. And this one? I didn't choose this fight, she said, but I'm glad I was in it with someone who knew what they were doing. It was not, in the grand scale of things, a dramatic statement, but it landed the way simple things landed when they were true, without fanfare, with weight. Van. Calhoun came out around midnight and walked Ethan through what they had, which was more than Ethan had expected and less clean than he'd hoped, which was the standard distribution of outcomes in situations like this. Damien's charges were solid. Probation violation, possession of a prohibited weapon given his record, criminal threatening, and a conspiracy charge related to Pruitt's action at Victoria's property that the DA would decide how to pursue. Pruitt was looking at breaking and entering, attempted intimidation, and whatever the conspiracy charge resolved to. Ryan, young, scared Ryan, was being processed separately, and Calhoun's read was that the DA would probably offer something light in exchange for full cooperation on Damien's coordination of events, which Ryan looked extremely ready to provide. He talked to your daughter, Calhoun said. The school incident. We have a witness, Madison's mother, and Lily's statement, which I'll need formally. I'll bring her in tomorrow, Ethan said. There's also the note on your truck, which we're treating as criminal threatening, and the rental break-in, which Ms. Langford is willing to pursue. Calhoun looked at him. It's a solid package. The DA is going to want a conversation, but I don't see this going anywhere except to arraignment. Okay. Calhoun studied him for a moment with the tired, practical eyes of a man who'd been in law enforcement long enough to have seen the full range of ways people process the end of something. You did this right, he said, coming to me, doing the coordination, walking in there with us in position. A pause. Could have gone different. I know. I mean, you could have gone in angry. Man approached your daughter. A lot of people would have gone in angry. Ethan looked at him. Angry would have been the wrong tool for it. Yeah, Calhoun said. It would have. He stuck out his hand. Go get some sleep, Ethan. Ethan shook it. Thank you. For tonight. Buy me coffee sometime, Calhoun said, and went back through the door. Pause. He drove to Concord to get Lily at 6:30 in the morning, which was earlier than he'd planned, but also as late as he could stand. He'd slept 3 hours on the couch after getting home at 2, not because 3 hours was enough, but because it was what his body had agreed to before insisting on being upright again. The family Lily was staying with, the Hendersons, whose son was in Lily's class, had been careful and kind about the whole thing, which Ethan had been grateful for in a wordless way he hadn't had the bandwidth to properly express. Karen Henderson met him at the door with coffee, which he accepted with more gratitude than was probably visible on his face, and told him Lily was up and had eaten and had only asked 3 times whether her dad had called, which Karen said with a warmth that told him she understood more of the situation than he'd explicitly shared. Lily came downstairs with her bag and looked at him with those green-gray eyes and didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at his face the way she did when she was taking inventory. And then she crossed the hallway and hugged him. Not the 12-year-old hug of daily life, but something older and tighter than that. Her arms all the way around him and her face against his shoulder, and a quality of relief in her grip that he felt in his chest and didn't trust himself to speak through for a moment. He held her. Okay, she said, muffled against his jacket. Yeah, he said, we're okay. She pulled back and looked at him again. Did everything everyone's safe. It's handled. He looked at her. You were incredible, you know that? The whole week. The way you handled it. She made a small face. I was scared the whole time. Yeah, he said, that's allowed. That's not the same as not being incredible. She thought about that for a moment, then nodded like she was filing it. Can we go to Carver's? She said. He almost laughed. Came out as a breath. Yeah, he said. We can go to Carver's. Well, they went on Saturday, which was 3 days after the warehouse, which was the next scheduled Saturday, but also felt like it needed to be Saturday for reasons neither of them articulated. Bet had heard, because Bet always heard, because Millbrook was the size of a place where things moved through the population the way water moved through soil, quietly and completely. And she met them at the door with a look that contained several things at once: relief, curiosity, and the specific warmth of a woman who had been running a community institution for long enough to understand that the community was the point. The usual, she said, not a question. The usual, Ethan confirmed. Lily got her hot chocolate and a scone and settled into the regular table with her dragon book, which was a new installment she'd ordered online and had arrived while she was in Concord, and which she had been visibly containing herself about since Thursday. Ethan got his coffee and sat across from her and read nothing because he didn't have the paper and didn't need it. He sat and watched his daughter read. She made a small indignant sound around page 40, which was encouraging. Whatever was happening in the book was apparently unacceptable in a way that needed to be registered. He didn't ask. He waited. Around page 45, she looked up. Are you just watching me read? Yes. She looked at him for a moment. That's weird. Probably. She looked back at her book. A pause. Then, without looking up, Dad, I'm okay. You can stop. I know you are, he said. Then, I'm not checking on you, he said. I'm just... He stopped. Found the honest version. I'm just glad you're here. She looked up at that, held his gaze for a moment with those eyes. Then she went back to her book, but something in her had settled differently, the way a person settled when they understood something they didn't need to say out loud. He drank his coffee. Victoria came in about 20 minutes later. He hadn't known she would. He hadn't told her they'd be here, or when. They hadn't spoken since the substation, since the hallway with the plastic chairs and the fluorescent lights, since the conversation about what does and doesn't help in ways you don't expect. But she came through the door, and she was in the wheelchair, and she looked at the room the way she always looked at spaces, the practical, thorough sweep of someone who'd been navigating other people's environments her entire life. And then she saw him and stopped. He nodded. She came over. She looked at Lily first. You must be Lily. Lily looked up from her book, looked at Victoria, looked at her father. Did the calculation that 12-year-olds did when they were applying everything they knew about a situation to a data point that hadn't existed before. Yes, she said. I'm Victoria. A pause. Your dad told me about your dragon books. Lily's eyebrows went up slightly. He did? He mentioned you were reading one. He didn't describe it as a dragon book specifically, but the cover seems self-explanatory. She glanced at the book, then back at Lily. Is it good? It's very good, Lily said, with the conviction of someone whose literary opinions were not casual. But the author keeps doing this thing where you think someone's safe and then they're not. That sounds like good writing, Victoria said. It's very stressful writing, Lily said. Victoria looked at her for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, something small and genuine that was different from her usual careful composure. Those two things are often the same thing. Lily looked at her for a beat, looked at her father, looked back. Do you want to sit down? Ethan had not said anything through any of this. He watched Victoria look at the table, at the chairs, at the chair closest to Lily's end that had enough clearance for her to pull alongside without rearranging the furniture. Sure, she said. For a few minutes. She settled in. Bet appeared with a coffee Victoria hadn't ordered, which told Ethan that Betta had already decided Victoria was a regular, a designation Betty apparently awarded unilaterally and without consultation. Victoria looked at the coffee and then at Bet. On me, Bet said, and left before it could be argued with. Victoria wrapped both hands around the mug. She looked at Ethan. How are you? Tired, he said. But okay. Lily says you watch her read. Ethan looked at Lily, who had her eyes entirely on her book, and was wearing the specific expression of a person who absolutely had not just said something and was not responsible for anything. Did she? She said you were doing it when I came in, Victoria said. She described it as weird, but also as something she understood. He looked at his daughter for another moment. Yeah, he said, I do that sometimes. It's a good thing, Victoria said. Not comforting, just her read on it, direct and simple. He met her eyes. The project, he said. Your community project. The accessible one. Where does it stand? She looked at him for a second, recalibrating. Why? Because you mentioned it a few weeks ago, and because, he paused, I build things. When I'm trying to figure out what comes next, I build things. It helps. He held her gaze. And it sounds like something worth building. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Whatever she was thinking moved through her face in ways she didn't try to hide and didn't try to show. The funding meeting is in 3 weeks, she said. In Boston. I think it's going to go well. What's the project? A community center, fully accessible. Not accessible the way buildings are accessible when someone checked boxes on a compliance form, actually designed from the ground up for people with physical disabilities. Workout space, workspace, childcare, indoor garden. She paused. Real ramps that don't require a key to activate. Bathrooms that actually work. Floors that don't have the specific texture that catches wheelchair wheels, and no one notices because they don't use a wheelchair. She said it without heat, but the detail behind it was the accumulation of a long life of navigating the gap between what accessibility meant on paper and what it felt like in practice. I can help with the build, Ethan said. When you get to that stage. She looked at him steadily. You mean that? I do. Why? He thought about it, said the honest thing. Because it's worth doing, and because I'd rather be building something than waiting for what comes next. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her coffee. When she looked back up, there was something in her face that was different from earlier. Not softer exactly, more like something that had been held at a careful measured distance, had moved half a step closer. Okay, she said. I'll take you up on that. 3 days after that, Ethan received a call from the county jail. He almost didn't take it. Unknown number, institutional prefix, the kind of call that came from detention facilities and debt collectors and survey companies. He took it on the fourth ring because he'd been waiting for something to arrive that he couldn't name. Mr. Cross, a corrections officer's voice. I have an inmate requesting a call transfer. Damien Voss, you can decline. Put him through, Ethan said. A click. Static. Then Damien's voice, quieter than it had been in the warehouse, flattened further by the phone connection. I didn't expect you to take it. I almost didn't. A pause. I need a stop. The sound of someone working out how to say something they'd probably been rehearsing and still hadn't gotten right. There's something I found out. After they brought me in, my lawyer went to my apartment. I needed some things. And there was an envelope in my stuff. From Marcus. Another pause. He left it with his commanding officer before that last deployment. Standing instruction to send it to me if a stop. I hadn't opened it before. I kept moving. And every time I thought about it, I put it away. The voice went slightly rough. I opened it last night. Ethan was quiet. He was standing in his kitchen, and the morning light was coming through the east window, and somewhere upstairs Lily was getting ready for school with the orchestral noise that suggested she'd misplaced something she needed. He wrote about you, Damien said. In the letter. He wrote... Another stop. A breath. He said if anything happened, he didn't want me going after anyone. He said the people he served with were family. He said... The voice broke. Genuinely broke. The sound of a man who'd spent a decade being held together by something specific and was now standing in what it was like without it. He said to forgive you if tragedy ever comes from it. Those were his exact words. He said he respected you. He said you were one of the ones he trusted. Ethan sat down at the kitchen table. I spent 9 years, Damien said. 9 years hating you. I planned this for... I drove from Manchester to Millbrook. I watched your house. I talked to your daughter. I broke into that woman's home. A stop. And my brother. My brother already wrote the answer 9 years ago, and I never opened it. Ethan didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say to that. Some things were too large for a response and required only the acknowledgement of being heard. I'm sorry, Damien said, for what I did to your daughter, for the woman, for... He stopped. I'm sorry. Ethan sat with that. He thought about Marcus Voss at 26 with a woman he was going to marry and a Sunday call to his younger brother every week without fail. He thought about the decision in 2017 and the weight of it he'd been carrying since. He thought about Damien driving from Manchester to Millbrook with a decade of grief compressed into something that had looked like hatred because hatred had somewhere to go when grief didn't. He thought about what it cost a person to hold something like that for 9 years, and what was left when you finally put it down. I hear you, he said. I accept the apology. He paused. Marcus would have wanted you to have some time left, Damien. With whatever you have, don't spend it here. A long silence on the line. The cancer, Damien started. I know, Ethan said. I know about the cancer. I'm not asking for anything. I know you're not. He paused. Your brother's letter says something true. I'm going to tell you something true back. Whatever I owe Marcus, and I owe him, the best way I know how to pay it is to be someone he would have respected, not just in the work, in how I live. He stopped, said it carefully. You carrying that letter around unopened for 9 years, that's not your fault. You were in pain and you needed somewhere to put it, but you opened it now and now you know what it says. Another silence, longer. Yeah, Damien said finally, barely audible. You've got time, Ethan said. Not as much as you should have, but some. Use it better than you've been using it. There was a long pause on the line. Not emptiness, something in it. A quality of a person sitting inside something difficult and not running from it. Okay, Damien said. Sounded like the word cost him something and also like he meant it in a way he hadn't been able to mean much of anything for a long time. The call ended. Ethan set his phone on the table. He sat there for a moment in the morning kitchen with the light coming in from the east and the upstairs noise of Lily finding whatever she'd misplaced. He heard the triumphant sound that meant she'd found it, and he breathed in the ordinary smell of his kitchen, coffee, and wood smoke from the night before, and the faint chemical smell of the cleaner he used on the counters. He was not relieved exactly. It wasn't clean enough for relief. But there was something, a shift in the quality of what he'd been carrying, not less heavy but differently arranged, the way the same weight felt different when you adjusted how you were holding it. He picked up his phone and texted Foley. It's over. 3 words. Foley would understand the shape of it. Foley texted back in under a minute. Good. You okay? Ethan typed, working on it. Foley, that's a yes from you. And then, a moment later, call sometime. He set the phone down. Upstairs, Lily's footsteps crossed her room and then the hall and then the staircase, the familiar percussion of a morning already becoming normal, already moving from the extraordinary back toward the ordinary, which was where real life happened. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with her backpack and her jacket half on, and a piece of toast she was eating with the focused efficiency of someone running 4 minutes behind schedule. She looked at him. You okay? She said, the same question she'd been asking for weeks now in the same way. Not worried, just checking, keeping inventory. Yeah, he said. I'm okay, Lily. She looked at him for a moment, took another bite of her toast. Victoria texted me, she said, last night. She said to tell you she confirmed the funding meeting. He looked at his daughter. You gave her your number? She asked for it. A shrug. She said she might have questions about the books. I think she actually might. She seemed genuinely interested. A pause. I like her. Ethan looked at his daughter, at the green-gray eyes and the half-on jacket and the toast and the absolutely intentional quality of someone dropping a piece of information and seeing what came of it. Good, he said. Is that all you're going to say? That's all I've got for right now. Lily gave him the look that said she wasn't fooled, and finished her toast and picked up her bag and headed for the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "Dad, the community center thing she's building." She held his gaze. "It's a good thing to be part of." "I know," he said. "Okay." She turned back to the door. "Pick me up at 3:30. I have that project thing." "I'll be there." She went out. The door closed. The house settled into its morning quiet, and Ethan Cross sat at his kitchen table in the ordinary light of an ordinary November morning and held the weight of the past several weeks and did not try to make it into anything cleaner or simpler than it was. A man had spent 9 years in grief and aimed it at him, and that man was now in a jail cell with a terminal diagnosis and a letter from his dead brother that contained the answer he'd been keeping himself from reading. There was nothing just about any of it. There was nothing resolved in the way resolutions were supposed to look. No symmetry, no clean accounting, no moment where the math worked out and everyone came through with exactly what they deserved. What there was, Lily was safe. Victoria was unharmed. Damien Voss was alive and in custody and had read a letter that told him the truth. Ryan was 23 and scared and would probably spend the rest of his life making different choices because of one very bad night. And Ethan was sitting in his kitchen, tired and awake, with 3 weeks until a funding meeting and a community center to eventually build, and a Saturday morning at Carver's that still existed as a thing in the world he could count on. He was not the Navy SEAL he'd been. He was not the man who'd made the call in 2017 and spent the years since carrying what it had cost. He was not finished being those things. You didn't finish being the things you'd been. They just became part of the full shape of what you were. He was a contractor in Millbrook, New Hampshire. He had a daughter who gave her number to people she'd decided were worth knowing. He had a friend in Virginia who texted, "That's a yes from you," and was right. He had a woman who'd asked him point blank if he'd done something wrong and had listened without flinching to the honest answer. He got up. He rinsed his coffee cup. He stood at the kitchen sink and looked out at the backyard where the November morning was doing what November mornings did in New Hampshire. Gray and cold, and completely indifferent to whether anyone found it beautiful. And he thought about lumber, about accessible ramps, about what it would take to build something from the ground up that actually worked for the people who needed it, not just the people who designed the compliance form. He was already thinking about the build. That, he knew from experience, was how you knew you were still here. The funding came through on a Thursday in December, 3 weeks after the warehouse. 2 weeks after Damien Voss was formally arraigned on 4 counts and remanded to county custody pending a bail hearing his lawyer apparently wasn't optimistic about. Victoria called Ethan at 7 in the evening, which was earlier than she usually called. They'd been talking more regularly by then, not by design exactly, but by the accumulation of reasons to. The way proximity and shared difficulty had a way of creating habits that felt natural before you'd consciously chosen them. "They approved it," she said when he picked up. No preamble. He was in the workshop, running a piece of oak trim through the table saw, and he turned the saw off and stood in the sudden quiet. "All of it?" "All of it. Full build budget, operating reserve, accessibility consultation fee included." A pause. And in it he could hear the specific quality of someone who'd worked towards something for long enough that its arrival felt more surreal than celebratory. "I've been staring at the approval email for 20 minutes trying to make it feel real." "Does it?" "Not yet." A breath. "It will. I think it will." Another pause. "I wanted you to know, you're—" She stopped, started again. "You're part of why this happened. Not the funding specifically, but the fact that I'm still here to get the call." He didn't argue with that, because arguing would have been its own kind of dishonesty. "When do you break ground?" "Spring, March if the permits clear fast, April more likely." A pause. "I need a contractor." He looked at the oak trim on the table. At the workshop, his hands had built around him over 5 years, tool by tool, shelf by shelf. The accumulated evidence of what a person did with themselves when they were trying to stay useful. "I know one," he said. She laughed, a real one, brief and a little surprised, the kind that came out before a person had decided to let it. He'd heard her laugh maybe twice before. It was a good sound. "Saturday," she said. "Carver's. I'll bring the preliminary plans." "I'll be there," he said. He hung up and stood in the workshop for a moment in the quiet and the smell of sawdust and machine oil and he felt something that took him a moment to identify because it had been absent long enough to feel unfamiliar. Not happiness exactly, or not only that, more like the specific sensation of a direction, of moving towards something rather than simply maintaining position. He went back to the trim. His hands knew what to do, and he let them. He told Lily at dinner. She received the information about the funding with the focused attention she gave things she'd already decided mattered, which told him she'd been thinking about it since Victoria had mentioned it weeks ago. "So you're going to build it," Lily said. Not a question. "Going to help build it," he said. "It'll be a full crew. I'm not doing it alone." "But you're the lead contractor." "That's the idea." She twirled her fork. "What's it going to look like? The building?" "I haven't seen the full plans yet. Saturday." She nodded. A pause. Then, the way she delivered things she'd been holding. "Is Victoria going to come to Millbrook more? Like, after the project starts?" He looked at his daughter, at the careful, deliberate casualness of the question. "Probably, yeah. The site's going to be just outside of town." "Okay." Another pause. She was looking at her plate with the expression of someone not looking at something. "She's different than I thought she'd be." "How so?" "I don't know. From what you said about her, I thought she'd be—" She searched for it. "Like, very official, but she asked me actual questions about the book, not like a grown-up asking to be polite, like she actually wanted to know." A beat. "She texted me about it again, by the way. She's on chapter 12. She said the part where you think someone's safe, and then they're not happened again, and she's filing a formal complaint." Ethan looked at his daughter. "She's reading the book." "She asked me what I was reading. I told her. She said she'd read it." Lily finally looked up. "She's following through. People don't always do that." He held his daughter's gaze for a moment. 12 years old, with her mother's eyes and her mother's way of paying attention to whether people meant what they said. She had been through a frightening several weeks with a steadiness that had cost her something. He knew that, had seen it in the tightness around her eyes in the first days after Concord, in the way she checked the locks at night now in a way she hadn't before. She was not the same as she'd been before the cafe and the note on the truck and the man who'd talked to her outside school. Some of that was just growing up faster than she should have needed to. But some of it was also a 12-year-old who had learned something about what her father was capable of and what the people in their lives were capable of, and had decided, in her quiet, considered way, what she thought about Victoria Langford. "No," he said. "They don't always do that." She nodded, went back to her dinner. "The indoor garden part of the community center," she said. "Can I help with that? When it gets to that stage, I know how to propagate from cuttings. We did it in bio." He looked at her. "You want to help build it?" "I want to be useful." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said true things. "Also, it seems like a good thing to be part of." Those were the words she'd used before. A good thing to be part of. He thought about what it meant that she was applying them here. To a project. To a person. To a shape of life that was something different from the careful, contained ordinary he'd spent 6 years constructing. "Yeah," he said. "I'll ask." She nodded like it was settled and reached for her water glass, and Ethan Cross sat across from his daughter at the kitchen table where they'd eaten 1,000 dinners and felt the future arrange itself differently than it had been arranged before. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just incrementally and honestly, the way real things changed. The plans were hand-annotated in 3 colors of ink, which told Ethan everything he needed to know about how long Victoria had been living with them. They spread across 2 tables pushed together at Carver's. Betty had rearranged without being asked, in the way Bet did things she'd already decided, and Victoria walked him through them with the precision of someone who'd had to explain her vision to people who didn't share it enough times to know exactly which details required emphasis. The building was single-story, which he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was the intelligence of the layout, the way every circulation path had been designed with actual turning radii in mind, rather than the theoretical minimums that looked right on paper and failed in practice. The way the garden space was positioned for maximum natural light through south-facing clerestory windows. The way the bathroom design specified fixtures he recognized as the good ones, the ones that actually worked, the ones that cost more than the ones people usually specified and were worth every cent. Who did the preliminary design? He asked. I did, with an accessible design consultant. She watched him look at it. You see a problem? Not a problem, he said. The north corridor here, he pointed. This width is right for the code, but if you're going to have two power chairs passing in opposite directions and someone carrying something, you want another 8 inches. She looked at where he was pointing. How much does that cost? Depends on what it moves. If this wall is non-load bearing, he checked the structural notes. It's probably a $10,000 change order, maybe less. That's worth it, she said, without hesitation. He looked at her. You haven't even gotten a formal bid yet. I know what that corridor feels like when it's 8 inches too narrow, she said. Flat, simple, the way she said things that came from experience rather than theory. It feels like someone designed it for the idea of you rather than for you. $10,000 to not feel like that is worth it. He nodded. He made a note on his own pad. He'd brought one, out of habit, and moved to the next section. They spent 2 hours at those tables. Betty brought coffee refills without being asked, and asked no questions, which was a form of generosity that Ethan had come to associate specifically with her. Other Saturday regulars came and went. The hardware store owner stopped to look at the plans out of professional curiosity, asked one question about the ramp grades, and seemed satisfied by Victoria's answer. Millbrook doing what small towns did, absorbing new things into its general awareness without making a production of it. At the end of it, Victoria rolled the plans and put them in the tube she'd brought them in, and she looked at him with those direct gray eyes. Are you in? I'm in, he said. You should know the timeline is aggressive. I want to be operational by fall. March permits, April break ground. Fall operational is aggressive, but not impossible. He paused. I'll need to clear my current client calendar through August. That's going to mean some conversations. Can you have them? Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. Ethan, I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish before you do anything with it. He set down his coffee. Okay. I have spent... She paused, found the words. I've spent most of my professional life being very good at not needing things from other people. Not because I'm particularly cold, because needing things from people, in my experience, created a specific kind of exposure that I learned early was more dangerous than useful. She looked at the rolled plans in their tube. That's not something I'm entirely proud of. It worked, but it cost things I didn't fully account for. A beat. The last several weeks have been, I had to let people help me. I had to trust that the deputy outside my rental knew what she was doing. I had to trust that you knew what you were doing. I had to trust that Lily was worth giving my number to. A small pause. I'm not good at trust, but She stopped. I'm finding it less dangerous than I thought. He held her gaze and let the full weight of what she'd said be what it was without trying to make it smaller. Thank you for telling me that. I'm not saying it because I want something from it, she said. I'm saying it because I think you should know that whatever this is, she gestured between them, at the plans, at Carver's, at the general shape of what had accumulated. It matters to me, genuinely, not as a transaction. I know, he said. Do you? Yeah, he said. I do. He paused. I'm not... He stopped, tried again. I've been very careful for a long time about what I let myself move toward. For Lily, partly, but also because he looked at his hands on the table, the scarred hands, the contractor's hands, the hands that had done things he didn't talk about at Carver's on a Saturday morning. I learned to be careful about what I wanted, because wanting things created a kind of exposure I didn't... He stopped, looked up. I'm using your exact words. I noticed, she said. Something in her face had shifted. The careful composure she usually wore had moved, not gone, but rearranged, showing more of whatever was underneath. I think that's probably not a coincidence. Probably not, he agreed. They sat with that for a moment. The ordinary Saturday morning noise of Carver's moved around them. Betty's voice from the counter, the bell above the door, somebody's kid asking loudly about whether they could get a cookie and being told, probably. Lily wants to help with the indoor garden, Ethan said. Victoria looked at him. Something moved through her face. She does. She said she knows how to propagate from cuttings, biology class. A pause. Then she's hired, Victoria said. And then, after a beat, she texted me last night. Did she tell you? No. She said the author resolved the thing she'd been filing a complaint about, but then immediately created a worse situation, and she wanted me to be emotionally prepared. A small, genuine smile. She said, and I quote, "It's a lot, but you can handle it." Ethan looked at the table for a moment. At the coffee rings and the winter light coming through Carver's front window, and the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of a morning that was becoming part of the pattern of his life. "She's not wrong," he said, "about the handling it." Victoria held his gaze. "No," she said. "I don't think she is." The permits cleared in late March, faster than expected because Victoria had a lawyer who understood municipal timelines and a project that the town planning board had been uniformly enthusiastic about in a way that surprised almost everyone except Bet, who said she could have told them Millbrook needed something like this and nobody had asked her. Breakground was the first Saturday in April, which meant Ethan was at the site at 7 in the morning with 2 of his regular crew and a rented excavator and the specific focused energy of a man beginning something. The site was on Clement Road, just north of town, a flat acre and a half that had been a failing nursery in a previous life, and still had the ghost of its greenhouse foundations in the soil. Good bones, Ethan had said when he first walked it. Victoria had said she'd counted on that. Lily came at 9, with a friend from school who'd been recruited by the same combination of persuasion and social pressure that Lily applied to most things she wanted. They stayed out of the way of the equipment with a conscientiousness that told Ethan Victoria had briefed them, and they spent most of the morning doing something with stakes and string that Ethan didn't ask about because it appeared to be productive. Victoria arrived at 10. She navigated the site in the all-terrain wheelchair she'd ordered specifically for site visits. Wider wheels, better clearance, a concession to practical necessity that she'd made without complaint and without pretending it wasn't a concession. She sat, at the edge of the cleared ground and looked at what was beginning to exist in the space where nothing had been. And Ethan watched her face from across the site while his crew worked, and what he saw there was not triumph. It was something quieter than triumph, the expression of a person who'd carried a thing for long enough that seeing it become real required a moment of adjustment between the imagined and the actual. He walked over, stood beside her. "It's happening," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She looked at the ground, the stakes, the string, the beginning of the lines that would eventually become walls. "A year from now, there will be a building here. October, if we stay on schedule. People will use it." "Yes," he said, "they will." She was quiet for a moment, then, "My mother used a wheelchair for the last 12 years of her life. She died in a care facility in Connecticut when I was 24. The last time we went out together, to a restaurant, just lunch, nothing special, we spent 45 minutes trying to find an entrance that actually worked. Not technically accessible, actually accessible." A pause. She never complained. She just navigated it. Every single time, she just figured out the workaround and kept going. Another pause, longer. "I think about her every time I work on this. Not..." She stopped. "Not in a sad way. In a, she should have had better. A lot of people should have had better. And now some of them will." Ethan stood beside her and said nothing, because what she'd shared didn't need a response so much as it needed to be held for a moment without someone rushing to fill it. After a while, Lily appeared at his other side, slightly muddy from whatever the stakes and string had involved, holding a measuring tape that didn't belong to her. "I found this," she said, handing it to Ethan. "That's Marco's," he said. "He's been looking for it for an hour." "Oh." She looked at Victoria. "The garden space, can I see where it's going to be? The stakes are confusing." Victoria looked at her. Then she looked at Ethan, then back at Lily, with an expression that had all of the complicated human arithmetic of someone who hadn't expected to feel at home somewhere and was finding that she did. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you." They moved off together across the site, Victoria pointing, Lily asking questions with the focused precision of someone who wanted actual answers, her friend trailing behind, taking photographs on her phone for reasons that probably involved a school project, but possibly involved something else entirely. Ethan watched them go. He thought about Marcus Voss briefly, as he sometimes did and probably always would. He thought about the decision in 2017 and the weight of it, and the fact that Damien Voss was currently in a county facility receiving cancer treatment as part of his custodial arrangement that his lawyer had negotiated, and that Ethan had written a letter to the DA's office supporting, not excusing what Damien had done, not pretending it hadn't happened, but contextualizing the grief that had driven it and the terminal illness that framed what remained of his life. He didn't know if the letter had mattered. He didn't know if Damien had been told about it. He knew only that writing it had been the right thing, and that the right thing was sometimes the only compass available. He thought about Sarah, not with the specific ache of the early years, but with the steadier quality of someone who had become part of how he understood himself. She would have liked Victoria, not unconditionally. Sarah had never liked anyone unconditionally, which was one of the things he'd loved about her. But she would have recognized in Victoria the particular combination of capability and honesty and the willingness to say hard, true things without dressing them up, and she would have approved. He felt that with enough certainty that it wasn't a guess. He thought about what it meant to rebuild something after the worst thing had happened. Not to replace what was gone, you didn't replace it, that was not how it worked, but to build beside it, around it, on the ground that was left. He had been doing that for 6 years, piece by piece, tool by tool, Saturday morning by Saturday morning. He was still doing it. The building on Clement Road was part of it. So was the woman pointing at stakes in the ground while his daughter asked questions she actually wanted answered. This was not a happy ending in the way endings were supposed to be happy. Tied off, resolved, the accounts balanced. It was messier than that and more honest. A man in jail with cancer who had spent 9 years in grief and had read a letter from his dead brother too late. A woman who'd been afraid for her life in the hallway of a rental house with a kitchen knife, who was now designing an indoor garden with a 12-year-old. A father who'd spent 6 years learning to be careful and was finding, incrementally and with more difficulty than he'd expected, that carefully chosen risk was not the same as the risks he'd been avoiding. Life was not a problem that resolved, it was a practice. You got better at it, or you didn't, and either way it continued past the point where you felt ready. Ethan put Marco's measuring tape in his jacket pocket and walked back to where his crew was working and picked up the level and went back to building. Now, the community center opened on the second Saturday of October. It was not finished. There were 3 rooms still without fixtures, and the outdoor pathway lights were back-ordered. And the garden had exactly 4 plants in it, because Lily had insisted on doing the propagation properly rather than buying mature plants, which meant the timeline was the timeline. But the main hall was done, and the accessible bathrooms were done, and the ramp to the main entrance was done with the correct grade and the correct surface texture and the correct handrail height. And Victoria had unlocked the front door at 10 in the morning and stepped back and let people come in. They came. Not a crowd, not an event. People from Millbrook who'd been watching the building go up. People from neighboring towns who'd heard about it through the specific networks that carried this kind of news. A few people who had no connection to the project except that they used wheelchairs or walkers or navigated the world in ways that most buildings did not accommodate well. And they came and they walked through the doors and they moved through the corridors, all of them wide enough. And they used the bathrooms and they looked at the 4 plants in the garden space, and Lily explained which ones they were and how they'd been propagated. Ethan stood near the back of the main hall and watched it. He was in work clothes because he'd been at the site since 7 and had not gone home to change, and he had sawdust on his jacket from the last piece of trim he'd installed that morning, the one he'd cut twice to get right, because he'd been tired and the first measurement had been off by 1/8 of an inch, which was the kind of mistake you caught and fixed and moved on from, and he held a cup of coffee from the folding table Bet had organized, because, of course, Bet had organized the coffee. Victoria came and stood beside him. She was looking at the room too. "The lighting in the east corner," she said. "I know," he said. "It's on the list. I'm not criticizing. I'm making a note." "I know." He looked at her. "It's a good building." She looked at the room, at the people in it. "Yeah," she said. "It is." Lily appeared from the direction of the garden, pulling a woman in her 60s toward the space with the enthusiasm of someone who needed to show someone something immediately. The woman was in a power wheelchair, and she was laughing at whatever Lily was saying, and Lily was gesturing with the expansive confidence of someone who'd spent 6 months thinking about this garden and had a lot of opinions about it. "She's going to run this place in 10 years, Victoria said. "She's going to run something," Ethan said. "I'm hoping it's not my life." Victoria looked at him sideways. "I think that ship may have sailed." He looked at his daughter across the room and felt something that he didn't try to name or contain, something that included grief and gratitude, and the particular ache of a person who understood that joy and loss were not opposites, but were in fact made of the same material, just arranged differently. "Yeah," he said, "probably." Victoria's hand found his. Not a gesture, not a statement, just a hand, warm and direct, the way she did everything. He didn't pull away. He stood beside her in the building they'd built, imperfectly, expensively, with arguments about door handles and corridor widths and lighting in the east corner, and held on. Outside, October did what October did in New Hampshire. The leaves on the trees along Clement Road had turned the particular red and gold of the season, and the light was low and clear and cold, and it fell through the south-facing clerestory windows exactly the way the plans had said it would, exactly the way Victoria had designed it to, and it crossed the floor of the main hall in long, warm rectangles that landed precisely where they were supposed to. Some things worked the way you planned them. Not everything, but enough. Ethan Cross stood in the light of a building his hands had helped bring into existence, holding the hand of a woman who'd trusted him with something real, watching his daughter explain propagation to a stranger with the absolute conviction of someone who believed the things she knew were worth sharing. And he understood, without needing to put it into words, what the last year had been about. Not the warehouse, not the threat, not the confrontation, not the hard, careful work of keeping everyone safe. Those were the events. The story was something else. The story was what a person did with what remained after the worst of it, whether they turned it into walls or into windows, whether they used what they knew how to build to close things off or to let things in. He had spent 6 years getting good at ordinary. He was still good at it. He'd just learned that ordinary could be larger than he'd let himself believe, could hold more than one life, could include the accumulated weight of grief and the specific surprise of what came after. The light moved across the floor. People moved through the building his hands had helped make real. His daughter laughed at something the woman in the power wheelchair said, a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a person completely present in a moment. He held on. That was enough. That was, in the fullest and most honest sense of the